Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay, a first-year graduate student of Technical University Munich's program of Responsibility in Science, Technology, and Society. This is our third episode of STS Shorts, a new video series from Eclectic Spacewalk in which we dialogue with a researcher, lecturer, writer, and/or eclectic human in the science, technology, and society discipline or related fields. These shorts will be around 30 minutes in length, and the goal is to highlight and hopefully introduce a new audience to our guests' research and work. Please grab a coffee, drink, and open your curious mind as we dive right in. So today we are pleased to be joined by Ranjodh Singh Dhaliwal. Ranjodh is the Ruth and Paul Idzik Assistant Professor in Digital Scholarship and English, and a concurrent assistant professor in the Department of Film, Television, and Theater. Welcome to STS Shorts.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Excited to be here.
So we'll jump right into some of your background. So can you give us a brief overview of your time before joining Notre Dame? And then how did you become interested in the field in the first place?
So I had, my background is essentially multidisciplinary. I did my undergrad in computer science and engineering from Indian Institute of Technology in Indore, before doing some grad work in English and media studies at the University of Chicago. I then was a PhD student in English and STS at the University of California, Davis, before coming here to the University of Notre Dame, where I work now in all of these adjoining areas. I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Like, how did you become interested in the field? Like, why was STS kind of there? I mean, you went from English, theater, some of these kind of new media stuff, and how did you kind of fall into STS?
Well, I think one of the things that became clear to me really early on as I was moving, not away necessarily, but sort of adding different dimensions to my own scholarship and thought after doing a bachelor's in computer science. One of the things that became quickly apparent to me was the fact that questions that were looking from a particular vantage point could always be enriched by joining other advantage points to it. STS kind of appeared on my radar as I was actually choosing grad schools to do my PhD in. And I mean, I hadn't even heard of STS until then, to be honest. But what was interesting was that when I was doing media studies or when I was doing English, we would look at the kind of materialities of the object in question, right? Like, so in English, you might look at a book and say, okay, so how did this come into a consumer's hand? What is the production of it? What's the logistics? Where is the book binding happening? You know, questions about the materiality of the book. Similar questions arise in media studies as well, where you can study a film, you can study the formal techniques in a film or something of that sort, or any media object for that matter. But you could also take it further and ask what's the history of camera as a technology within this field, right? So it's kind of been my position from my own sort of understanding and training that good media technology studies work is indistinguishable from good science and technology studies work, because work that's really exciting to me and the one that I'm both trained in and now I profess is the one that does not take these things as separate dimensions, but takes them in some ways as modes of inquiry that should be joined and considered together. So I guess I would say that sort of thinking about the technological aspects of media studies drove me towards technology studies, which opened up this whole realm of STS to me. And I've not really looked back since.
Onwards and forwards. Yeah, that's great. So, on your website, you mentioned kind of your pedagogy and kind of how you kind of think about things, and you mentioned a little bit about that, the interdisciplinariness of a lot of this, and your pedagogical practice is extremely, quote, multi, trans, and interdisciplinary. Can you speak about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I guess there is, well, there's a taxonomical distinction there that I guess that sentence is focusing on, that we can talk at length if need be. But ultimately, I think, and this is continuing the train of thought that I was just talking about. It seems to me that good pedagogy needs to account for other points of view in a robust fashion.
Sure.
And as a result, even when I'm teaching my students here in English, they might read sociology. They definitely will read history and media studies. They will definitely read sort of science studies and science fiction studies. Because I do not, again, see these approaches as being in some ways distinct from each other, but more sort of co-joined, and things that once you add on top of each other, you get a clearer account. It's also often the case that you really cannot develop a reflective perspective on what you do and how you do, and the things that you take for granted, unless you step outside the realm of understanding that thing, right? So if for example, you're teaching, I don't know, something about computation in society, and you fail to take into account that, say, computer scientists or tech journalists or people who do tech ethics or philosophers of technology have all these, have built in some ways like parallel worlds that they traverse, but rarely sort of talk to each other, because, I guess there's no institutional need in most cases to do that. So it's refreshing to see when those bridges are crossed, because then in some cases there's a radical self-reflection that probably, I think, lets you think better. Because usually, and that's where I think a little bit like an anthropologist, my goal is frequently when I encounter a point of view from another disciplinary configuration that I'm just like, wait, what? My first reaction is usually, wait, what? But my second reaction is, but how does this function within that? Like, how do, say, sociologists do consider of this, right? Like, what's the internal logics in this discipline? And I think that's a really productive sort of train of thought that I highly encourage my students in my classes to sort of take up, which is to say that we critique and study everything from these robust understandings of longue durée histories and philosophies and cultural notions. But before we get to the stage of critique, we basically try to ascertain what would make the world take this as a thing. And the moment you step into that zone, I think you're starting to build these multi-trans, post-disciplinary now sort of orientations that can be really, really useful.
No, well said. And so when you say that, and I guess continuing this line of thought a little bit, and we talked a little before, we started recording, if you will, is like, how do you bring kind of reflexivity, acting not just for your own personal biases or influences, but also maybe the institutions you're at, the, disciplines that you're within. So how do you kind of bring that into your research on top of that, or at least maybe say a little bit about teaching that and that kind of attitude or notion, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I think, again, one of the cool things about STS, and that's more true for STS than the other disciplinary configurations I belong to, is that STS is a brutally self-reflexive discipline, because it studies practices, often, not exclusively, because it often studies practices. It is usually trying to be cognizant of the practices that it engages in. And so a lot of like even, canonical STS work from laboratory studies or whatever, goes on these flights of self-reflectivity, which I think are, absolutely critical to its distinctiveness as a disciplinary configuration. And so when it comes to kind of inculcating some of that in the classroom, one of the things that I think I often do is that we think about educational institutions and their role and you know the sort of not only their social, cultural, and historical role, but more specifically their micro the micro practical operations. So for example, if I am, again, and this is true for almost any kinds of classes that I teach, students would often do infrastructure projects where they would actually look at the places that they are studying in and try to, again, you know, it's a terrible way of framing it for 1,000 different reasons, but one way of doing that is to say we're kind of close reading the world that we ourselves belong to, right? So you go out into the quad and try to figure out these entanglements that we've now only studied at, like, you know, whatever, undersea cables or something that we've studied in the class. What would that study look like if we were to do it on our own institution? What would sort of historical studies of influence and prestige or power look like if you wanted to borrow that model and kind of use that spotlight on the departments or the institutions that you belong to? And I think it often is the case that students and colleagues and scholars and thinkers at large can be well served by not necessarily being critical, but at least being reflexive about the conditions under which their own scholarly and pedagogical work is produced and sustained.
Totally.
So it's a very Bourdieuian approach, but not solely sociological.
So if STS and maybe is being a little bit more reflexive and even critical at some points, maybe that's a kind of point in the right direction. What are some, I guess you could say, things that maybe STS still needs to improve on? Because one of the things that we just kind of have been reading is methods, and how in the 21st century, the sociological methods are kind of still stuck in the 18th century and et cetera. But how do we, kind of come into the complexity of 21st century? How can STS be even more reflexive and improve, because I think that it's not over by any means. STS hasn't, won the game, if you will, and obviously not trying to put it into false dichotomies, but what can, improve? That's really,
Yeah, I think that's a really good question that I'll have to think about. So I mean, I guess think out loud.
Of course. Yeah, this is what we're here for.
I think in some ways, one, I don't think there's too many games left for STS to either win or lose. But I take your point, and I think generally speaking, I agree. STS as an orientation, as a configuration, is barely getting started. I think one of the things that STS could and should do more, and again, this is probably me looking from my own vantage point, is to really think about the sort of, I guess STS could be a little more cognizant of different levels of political operations, firstly. I think STS, as it exists today, either speaks about politics of things, which has its own politics, or either it speaks about politics and science and technology at the sort of most abstract level. I think there are sort of middle spaces that still need to be filled that STS could well work on. The other thing that I think STS could be more cognizant of is the sort of, and again, it's not to suggest that it isn't, it's just to suggest that it isn't the mainstream scholarly discourse in SCS. STS could be more cognizant of things in the middle, of the kind of mediating aspects of science, technologies, instruments, experimental setups, sort of,
right.
Again, when we talk about cultural production, the the granular details of things that produce those things that we end up calling culturally produced or something of that sort, socially produced. So I guess there are a lot of these micro things that could be filled, but at a much more high level, I think STS could do well by actually trying to intervene. And again, some of this already happens at the level of policy, at the level of art. So this is not to in any way deny that happens, but I see no reason why sooner rather than later, sort of interventions into science and technology can actually come via, if not from, science and technology studies. And I think eventually science and technology studies will need to sort of really think about the way it makes things, it breaks things maybe, and breaking is as important as making.
Well said. Yeah, exactly. So moving on to, your current research, from your website, it kind of says that, you interrogate the sciences, the arts, and the popular culture to investigate politics and computation in the long 20th century. And then also, let's just get into your first book project, which is titled Rendering, which I thought was super interesting. It, quote, shows how social relations and ideologies move through machines, looking first at how they get hard-coded into media technologies, and then how these political machines contort and reproduce those ideologies. So maybe if we continue on that vein of, Langdon Winter, everything has, a politics, but then also if we go higher to an ontological kind of politics of how machines in general, maybe tell us a little bit about your book and that, or the first book project, and how that came to be, et cetera.
So my first book project is in some ways a direct product of me wanting more in the textbooks that I was studying as a computer science major. Me wanting a little more robust sort of engagement with where technology comes from and what it does, instead of sort of biographical genealogy of great computer inventors of one form or another, or a progressivist account of how computing was meant to always move forward. The fact that, we are being taught this at the end of Moore's law was also interesting, because you then reflect on it and be like, oh, but the progressiveness is not really a given here. And then you go into 1,000 different directions, which partially my book addresses. But my book largely thinks through a theory of rendering. Now, rendering is a term that's used in multiple ways. It's a pretty multivalent term. It quite literally means to graphical rendering, which is the graphical production of 3D models on 2D screens, are now 3D sort of outputs. But it's also, rendering is also used in the term of translation. Rendering is often used as a word that denotes giving physical form to something that's conceptual, or something that is sort of phenomenological. So there's a number of different ways that rendering sort of enters a contemporary vocabulary. And a part of the book's project is to suture all of these things. But more specifically, the book is thinking through the history of computation anatomically. So what I do with each chapter of the book is that I take, if the structure of the book persists, I take one component each. So you start by breaking open the machine physically. The book starts with me actually opening up a PC that I had assembled myself, and then taking apart each unit and looking at its history, but not specifically just the history of how CPUs come to be, but its operative history, which is to say the kind of work that the CPU does. Where does that come from? What are its predecessors, not just within the history of digitality, but before that in the history of analog computing, or before that in the history of mechanical computing, or before that in the history of human computers, right? When people still computed, who we called computers. So taking me on these longer trajectories, the project then essentially traces these operations, these political operations that become machinic, and then traces the output of it, like what happens when a certain kind of operation that used to be done by these laboring forces in the following way becomes machinic. And what does that do then to our understanding of computation and culture at large? There's other elements and other ways that I am conceiving of the book project. There's a whole science fictional angle to it. There's other ways that I could go on, but that's kind of largely it. It's a history and theory of computation, thinking really about the translational between physicalities and sort of ideological political economic operations.
Super cool. That's awesome. And then moving on from computing is another project that you're kind of getting into, as well as the practices and politics of talking about or telling stories about data. We live in a world where big data, et cetera. And so you say, quote, combining narratology. I want to talk to more about that. What is that? And science studies. The project investigates how different communities create stories with data. And so in doing so, you outline possible ways of living with data responsibly. So is it possible to, get to the promised land of actually using data responsibly? Like, is that actually possible?
I wish I had an answer to that.
Yeah, it can be an open-ended answer.
No, so that project essentially arose from me considering and thinking about the data science subdiscipline of data storytelling. So today, if you do a degree in data science, you will be taught both pedagogically, like textbooks, and otherwise in classrooms, that it's not really only important that data is collected and processed, but also that we can actually make stories out of data that can be then, because humans don't always sort of conceive of a spreadsheet and understand what I'm supposed to get out of it. You need to actually narrate the causal chains of events or something of that sort in that spreadsheet. So that project is essentially thus bringing tools from narratology, which is this long-standing field in literary criticism, the study of narratives, which actually began somewhat precisely by thinking about how is it that stories get made from individual units that may go into a book, right? Like you may say X happened and Y happened. And then the human reader will be like, oh, okay, so it means X must have led to Y, or maybe that's not the correlation or whatever it is. So thinking about narratives from individual entities is something that narratology is really good at and has been doing in the longer historical context. And so to bring that lens to bear on sort of the history of data and data cultures at large is the goal in there. But I do want to point out that the responsibility part, I think, partially comes from the fact that we have a somewhat limited definition of what data is within mainstream discourse of data. And that basically thinks about quantitative data, usually collected via certain operations that are reproduced all over in corporate and public spheres. But if you start really thinking about data in a more capacious sense, I mean, it's in the philosophical sense, data is like what is given, right? So if you start thinking about data in terms of, for example, qualitative data, you would find that fiction writers or anthropologists or sociologists work with data and tell stories about it. But that process might look very different from what is taught in data storytelling or data journalism. And as a result, sort of coming to terms with these ways in which different cultures tell stories and different groups of different communities tell stories without different kinds of data is the whole sort of large project that's lying ahead of me. I hope, and I think I have a I hope that I will find ways that are sustainable. Because again, if you look at it that capaciously, then writing fiction is data storytelling of a very different kind. And one would be hard pressed to pull the critiques of data cultures onto that sphere one-to-one, which means that there will be some nuances that I think I hope to discover in this process. And that is a part of the goal. The part of the goal is to look at how different communities deal with these questions, not necessarily a sort of hegemonic data culture at large that we otherwise get embroiled in pretty often.
Yeah, that's very not just informative, but very inquisitive and different. Like I mean, not just quantitatively, because you think about data normally, but qualitatively as well. Super interesting. Your last project that we can talk about, or your big last project, is critical making practices. I thought this was one of the cooler kind of things, like experimental and like actually doing stuff with your hands. So a significant part of, the scholarship involves critically thinking through processes of making via speculative design or by working on video games and other digital media forms. So, I mean, how many video games have you made, and how and how are you thinking of that critically, and how you kind of world build and all those kind of things that come in with it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's a number of ways I guess I could approach that. So a part of that practice comes from my overlapping interest with video game studies and video game design at large. I've been a part of two bigger sort of teams that have made different kinds of video games. There was Frack, which was a video game that was supposed to be a mode of reflection of how fracking at the corporate level works and the subjectivities involved in sort of national and international fracking. And then another really big team project that I'm involved in, which is still ongoing, and we're hoping to have a sort of a public launch sometime this year, is a sort of narrative experiment with Fold It, which is a really popular citizen science game in which players fold protein molecules, and the way that they fold protein molecules actually give data back to scientists who work with these things. So citizen science, again, with the clear sort of acceptance of its limitations and critiques, nevertheless, is the area in which this game actually tries to use science fictional storyline to inculcate some kind of reflexivity within the players, because they are themselves at that moment practicing science, whether they like it or not. And it's a different kind of science than when you do it in the lab, but it's nevertheless a kind of science. And so one way that people often do reflection and thinking about science is by like using science fiction. So in this case, explicitly providing a science fictional narrative to the game in which they're doing science helps at multiple scales think about better and more ethical practices, or ethical, more responsible perhaps, or just more interesting practices that we may anyway otherwise be engaged in, to encourage thinking about it. Generally speaking, my critical making practices stretch in all directions. We do a lot of game design in my classes. I myself do sort of experimental projects. So when I'm doing sort of, for example, the history of computer graphics for my rendering project, I would often use older softwares and try to play with them, both to get like a feel of how is it that this would have worked at one point of time, to inculcate the experiential, but also to think about how is it that these fields could be designed differently, or how these sort of technical operations could happen differently. So ultimately, the goal of critical making is to have this robust knowledge of both making breaking practices. I mean, the lab that I was trained in at Davis was called Mod Lab, and modding and remaking and hacking was a really a critical goal of that group of scholars. Is to basically think about how is it that we can make, unmake, break, and make differently the technical objects, the scientific objects that we are otherwise anyway studying in our scientific practices. And again, scholars of STS, or media technology in this case, are uniquely situated to do this because they are the ones who know both the technical ins and outs and the social, cultural, and political ins and outs. And so I think it's also a part of the scholarly responsibility in some ways, be like, if you are the person who, if you're one of the few people who like actually has the ability to do these things, then why not? Like, why not make technologies differently? And again, it probably won't look quite the same, and it probably definitely wouldn't lead to patents in the same way as it might if I was practicing computer scientist, but it might lead to interesting, cool things that you can talk with others about and hopefully have a good time. And that's a goal.
It's a great goal, worth it, valuable, especially to mod it and mess with it and change it again. So we've just at 30 minutes, so I'll ask you one last question. You kind of have some other pieces, working with kind of TikToks, new media, cringe as an aesthetic category, super interesting, co-construction of media ecologies, neural networks, et cetera. And then even, I have to bring this up because it's my favorite video game, an edited collection on FIFA, which, kind of has an experimental interface between real life sports and video game simulation. Like, maybe you don't have to spend too much time on that, but maybe just talk a little bit about like what you're most excited about, moving forward, because it seems like there's a lot of, irons in the fire, if you will. There's a lot of interesting kind of things happening, not just for, sake of it being interesting, but then also, like we've been talking about, co-constructing some of these things to hopefully have a little bit of an air of responsibility. So like, what are you most excited? And, that'll be kind of our closing question.
That's a tough one because you've already laid out like a number of different directions that I'm all really, really excited about. I think the one thing that I might add to that is that, and I've not really mentioned it, or perhaps this won't even be a thing, 3 weeks from now. So you've just probably caught me on the day that I'm thinking about it and I'm most excited about it.
That's okay. Let it rip. Let it rip.
But I'm really looking forward to, I have been doing this thing where, so every time I teach in almost any course that would have sort of critical cultural component to computation and technology, I usually try to do a day on memes. And so what we do there is essentially look at the memes that might have just recently come up, and try to really seriously engage both with sort of meme archaeology, which is the kind of the media archaeology of memes. So thinking about where memes come from and what are the kind of technical processes that let memes be viral in one way or another, but also a sort of cultural reading, right? Like the way that you would read visual culture. Like, what does this meme really say? In what ways? And how do different, again, communities think about these sort of viral mimetic operations? So one of the things that I just realized that I had been doing already since quite a while was I was coming up with like these readings of different memes and different sort of snapshots in my own history. And I have like these snippets written about all of them. And I just realized, I think one day in the future, whether that's 3 years or 30 years from now, I think I would like to kind of collate that as a time capsule and see how memes or what kinds of memes worked at what points of time in history. So if any publisher wants to contact me, let me know. No, just kidding. But that's something that I'm like really excited about, as I was actually thinking about my lecture on memes in a few weeks. So maybe that's something that will be a thing. Maybe I'll forget that I had that thought tomorrow, but for now I'm thinking about it.
That's great, because honestly, one of the coolest things like that you mentioned, like memes come and go, but then sometimes there's resurgences. And then one of the coolest things that I think of is when you get like a crossover between different memes, like that's super interesting when you get to kind of that level. But cool. So that's all the time we have. Thanks for coming on STS Shorts and giving your time. And I really appreciate it. I think a lot of people will be interested in your work and research. So appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me here. It was wonderful chatting with you, and look forward to interfacing further.
Of course, on Twitter,
On Twitter. All right.
We'll see you later, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.